Pharmacy. Thank you for being here. A very interesting topic that my colleagues and our fellows for this year, Dr. Monlick and Dr. Sherman, have want to talk about misinformation. We've all been victims of misinformation on the internet. Even though you might think it's right, they're going to help us, and I'm excited to hear this presentation. So, gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Gregory. So like Dr. Gregory said, we're going to be talking about misinformation and how to handle that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the issue, but then also steps we can do in order to do our own research, making sure our websites and what we're searching is reputable. Oh, sorry. Just hit there we go. So like you said, I'm Dr. Munlock and he's Dr. Sherman, or vice versa. No, I did that right. We're a drug information fellows. So this first year we're at Belmont. We're with Dr. Engel, teaching biomedical literature evaluation. And then in the second year, I'll be going to Aegis Science Corporations and he'll be going to Health Trust. So like I said, I'm gonna be talking a little bit about the misinformation that's present. And then when Dr. Sherman comes up, he'll talk about tips and tricks and how to potentially avoid that. Disclaimer, we're not making any medical recommendations. We're just presenting the data as found in the research. So where do you get your information? It seemed like in the past we'd get it from newspapers, but nowadays it just seems like little old granny is on Facebook kind of believing whatever she sees. I think this slide potentially says a lot. In terms of social media and some of the apps that are popping up on the screen, I'm afraid this is where a lot of people have been getting their news, and I don't think I would market any of these as reputable medical sources by any means. So it's something we have to be careful about. In terms of just the other day when I was on my Facebook, I got this ad pop up that this is an example of a company that's trying to profit off of the propaganda and fear that's going on. As you can see from the logos there, we were thinking about getting these shirts, but I thought that might be a little inappropriate. But in terms of this company, they're trying to get more clicks, more views, and then eventually more money. So people are trying to profit off this fear as well. In terms of search engines, I'm just throwing a couple on the screen. I think we probably all have our favorite. It's probably that big one in the middle. But these are also tools, and we want to show you how to properly use these tools. I don't think I have to convince anyone that misinformation is present on the internet. This is a study that was done with the graph. Basically, it's showing that examples like drugs, pandemics, vaccines, there's a certain percentage of misinformation present on these internet websites, social media websites. Some of the websites this study was evaluating was like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. So just a fun little graphic there. In terms of graphics, this one I made, we do have to be a little bit careful. I'm afraid that with COVID-19, a lot of politics has played a role. So I'm kind of showing different news outlets and how they fall, left or right, Republican, Democrat, and I try to space it out as much as possible as we can see. Because in terms of recommendations and the overall story, it seems like based on what political aspect they fall on, that's the story they're trying to prove. Treatment trends during COVID-19. So we're seeing a lot in the news, we're seeing a lot in our daily lives and in practice if we're practicing. Some that are popping up there is hydroxychloroquine, which we'll talk about for a second. Obviously vaccines, we can't forget about ivermectin, which we're still talking about to this day. And I don't think I'll talk too much about bleach, to be honest. But we can keep going. I do just want to preface that the more you search, the more you find. A lot of these websites use algorithms, specifically YouTube. The more you search for a video, the more you watch that video, the more YouTube is going to try to show you more of that. So it's kind of like showing you what you want to find, which is not what we want. So don't be like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. Bye, Alice. So the world we live in today. So this is a screenshot of an article that I found that was floating around social media. I'm afraid it was done to discourage people from getting the vaccine. But then even wait, what I just said was a misinformation, because if you look at the disclaimer, I actually made that in Microsoft Paint. It probably took me maybe 5 minutes. We can look at the top left corner. It came from the New England Journal of Marmalade, which I don't think is right. And your eyes probably glossed over the authors a little bit, but look at some of the authors. Justin the Juice, Crispy Bacon, Lawnmower, Rick Astley. I don't think any of those people are qualified to make this talk. So as the screen changes, this was the actual article that I found, the actual screenshot. All I did was change the title, change the journal, and then change some of the authors. I even got rid of some of the DOI numbers as well, which is all important. But we can just show, I'm not very good with computers, but even I, in Microsoft Paint, which is probably as old as I am, was able to make that change. So we have to be careful in what we see on these news outlets. In terms of going right to the vaccines, these are some research, clinical trials that were done to show and hopefully encourage people to get the vaccine. In terms of COVID occurrence 7 days after the second dose, in terms of number of cases, for people that were in the COVID vaccine arm, 8 out of about 18,000 got COVID, and then in placebo arm, the patients that didn't receive the vaccine, it was about 162 out of 18,000. In terms of surveillance time, that was comparable, pretty similar. But overall vaccine efficacy was 95% with a credible interval of 90.3 to 97.6. Here's another journal or article that was done. They're looking at the endpoint of efficacy of the COVID vaccine in terms of assessment starting 14 days after the second dose. For patients in the placebo arm that did not get the vaccine, there was an occurrence of 185 people out of about 14,000. And patients that received the vaccine, only 11 out of 14,000. Again, the vaccine efficacy is relatively high, 94.1%, with a confidence interval of 89.3 to 96.8, and an incident rate of about 3.3. But we also have to be careful on how we state this as well. This was an article by the CNN, and they say verbatim, based on the title, people vaccinated against COVID-19 are less likely to die from any cause the study finds. But overall, as clinicians and researchers and medical professionals, we are trained to look at research. We need to go into the actual research and see what it says. So we did, and this is the article that CNN is quoting. But overall, based on some of the highlighted sections, they didn't account for baseline characteristics or underlying comorbidities, which we know from COVID that patients with a lot of comorbidities don't do as well from the infection. And then also how they included deaths were not correct either. But overall, even what they say, I can't even say it because they're saying it, the findings might not even be able to be applied to the general population. So we have to be careful on how we word these kind of things. In terms of ivermectin's, everyone's favorite drug, the FDA calls it horse dewormer, so it seems pretty obvious not to take it. It is an FDA-approved drug, and here are a couple of the indications, and then even in 2015, it won the Nobel Prize. But then looking specifically at that drug in COVID-19, there is research out there. So in terms of articles we were looking at, this one in particular, the primary outcome was time to resolution of symptoms in number of days. For patients that received ivermectin, which was about 200, it was about 10, versus placebo, which was about 198 patients, the time to resolution of days was 12. So it was only an absolute difference of -2 with a confidence interval of -4 to 2. So across is 0, so it's not statistically significant. And then an effect estimate of 1.07 with a confidence interval of 0.87 to 1.32. So across is 1, so it's not statistically significant. Then we can also look at the p-value as well. Typically we're looking at how that compares to alpha. Alpha is typically 0.05, and this p-value is greater than that at 0.53. One more trial. In terms of efficacy, or in terms of primary endpoint for this trial, it was looking at number and percentage of hospitalizations. So for patients that received ivermectin, which was about 200 patients, 14 had hospitalizations, while in placebo, 21 had hospitalizations. It was an odds ratio of 0.65, which is less than 1, so it showed a less occurrence of hospitalizations. But if you look at the confidence interval, it crosses 1 with a confidence interval of 0.32 to 1.31. And again, the p-value is greater than 0.05 at 0.227. This meta-analysis was kind of floating around as well. It does actually show some promising results in terms of ivermectin. A meta-analysis takes a bunch of journals and articles and compiles the data together to try to find the best result. This was looking at death from any cause. So in patients that did not receive ivermectin, death from any cause was 78 per 1,000, while patients that received ivermectin was 48 fewer deaths per 1,000. even how they're stating the data isn't correct. It really should be 30 per 1,000, but by saying 48 fewer, they're making it seem better than it actually is. In terms of relative effect, it was 0.38 and a confidence interval of 0.19 to 0.73. That doesn't cross 1, so it's statistically significant. They had quite a few number of participants, but then overall the quality of evidence was moderate. But with meta-analyses, we need to look at potential bias and also heterogeneity as well, and how different these articles are from each other. If you can really say the same thing, if you can really make a conclusion. I even attached a website from The Atlantic that had peer-reviewed researchers contact the authors of these individual studies, and even for some of those studies, one of the studies was discounted, another one they weren't collecting the data correctly, so it kind of throws out the window a little bit of the actual validity of this meta-analysis. Now, I said a lot of numbers, a lot of definitions, and now some of you may recognize this. Our patients probably don't. They don't know what a p-value is, they don't know what a confidence interval is, but we as medical professionals and pharmacists, we're trained to evaluate this data. We look into research and we try our best to answer these questions. That's something that Dr. Sherman and I do every day. We work over in Border Hall in the Chris C. Houston Foundation. We answer drug information questions, evaluate literature, protocols, research that's coming out, and we also teach this in the class. We teach biomedical literature evaluations. We're teaching the next generation of pharmacists how to evaluate this literature and this research properly. Pharmacists play a great role in terms of research and being able to determine if it's valid or not. This was an article done by a really reputable cardiology journal that was actually retracted after a pharmacist looked at it, noticed some issues, and then posted on Twitter that it wasn't correct the way they did their data. So that was even retracted. And then this trial, this was done to show hydroxychloroquine effect on COVID. And it didn't show great results, but even this one was retracted because of how they collected the data. It wasn't accurate, or it wasn't the correct way to do it. This is a journal that one of our students recently found, and it's not even peer-reviewed, which we know as scientific professionals and people in the medical community, it needs to be peer-reviewed to be valid. So do not do your own research is what a lot of people are saying. And that's kind of what gave me the motivation to do this talk in the first place. I know there's a lot on this slide, but we want to show you that you can look at reputable sources, which Dr. Sherman is going to get into. So we're not saying do not do your own research, we're saying be smart about it, and from the tips that Dr. Sherman is going to talk about, we're kind of going to show you the right way to do it. So think for yourself, and I want to welcome Dr. Sherman up here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, John Wick there. Appreciate you. Okay, let's see if we can type this out. Thank you, Dr. Munlock. So, how do you decide if a website is trustworthy? So we're going to show you a nice, easy way to go about it, and how they kind of formulate whether a resource is considered reliable and credible for medical use. So it's actually this little application called Health on the Net. It's an easy to use Google Chrome extension that you can find in the Google Chrome store. It'll actually, so Health on the Net is a nonprofit organization where websites can actually submit their content into Health on the Net, and Health on the Net will determine whether it is an actual, credible source using these 8 criteria that I'm going to go over now. And these are all just general criteria that we look at a very frequent basis whenever we are looking at sources ourselves, but we want to go over how Health on the Net actually verifies the information being usable and being correct. So again, if you see the Health on the Net code at the very bottom of a website, that means that it's been submitted and it's been accepted by Health on the Net as a credible resource, and you could actually search Health on the Net, the actual app, to see what information they have on particular subjects. An extremely easy to use, very, very user-friendly way of making sure that you're getting the right information from the right places, because health information constantly evolves, it constantly changes. And again, it's right here down at the bottom. It's a little emblem. It'll actually flash up if it's a Health on the Net website as well. So the first criteria that they go by to make sure that the site has authority, the correct people are doing these type of studies. We have medical doctors, PhDs, PharmDs. And not only that, but where they practice, where they found their expertise, why are they able to talk about what they're talking about, right? So it's important that they state that. And if they're not healthcare professionals, they need to say that they're not healthcare professionals, okay? So that goes into authority. Our second one is complementarity, right? So complementarity is a word that you may not be familiar with. I had to look it up myself initially, but in terms of this, it's talking about the relationship between the patients and their providers, right? So the mission statement of the website of the actual creators should be something along the lines of, we encourage, right? This is not to replace the connection between a patient and their healthcare provider. This is to encourage it, right? So we want to make sure that the audience of who they're trying to talk to, whether it be healthcare providers or non-healthcare providers, is stated, and to make sure that this isn't separating physicians and pharmacists from the actual patients who give up-to-date knowledge to the actual patients. So confidentiality is our third one. We want to make sure that we're obviously going to safe websites, right? We want to make sure that the data, whenever you go onto a website, isn't given to a third-party resource. If there is cookies, the reason as to why they're using the cookies, right? There should be some sort of policy statement whenever you go onto a website that's certified by HON. So attribution. There should be resources and references that make sense as to where they get their information from. You can't just put data out of conjecture without having some sort of resource or some sort of reference as to where you're getting this data from. So anything that's Health on the Net credible is attributed to some sort of resource that makes sense for that particular piece of information. Then there's justifiability that goes right along with attribution. Justifiability is giving the full picture of something, not just a little perspective of the entire problem. I feel like in COVID-19 especially, we see only little bits and pieces of what certain people have seen or what they've heard. Justifiability is giving the full content of what is actually being looked at, the actual information in total, the benefits and the risks, right? And then we go into transparency. So transparency is as simple as, is there any way to contact these people who have written this study? Is there any way to comment on this study? There has to be the continuing evolution of this research. We have to take what they found and further it, right? Because in COVID, we're still not over this pandemic. We've made great strides, but there needs to be some way to be able to reach these authors and maybe collaborate. And it also needs to be known that there has to be easier ways to navigate some of these websites. Some of these websites have restricted views. Some of them are just complicated. There needs to be an easy way for people to understand and access the information to be certified as Health on the Net credible. Second to last one is financial disclosures. There needs to be something that says where the website is getting its money from. Whether this be, a potential bias, or whether this be, any funding the authors may have received, or any sort of conflicts of interest or any employment that they have. This needs to be stated to eliminate any sort of issues that may come along with this information. It needs to be clearly identified to make sure that this website is credible and, most of all, reasonably funded by people who make sense. And last but not least, advertising policy. So there needs to be some sort of advertising policy, whether the site accepts advertisements or not accept advertisements for funding, but the advertisements need to be separate from the actual content. I feel like a lot of the times websites may promote a product or may promote a business, and that may intermingle in with the actual content that they're trying to present, which can be very confusing to patients and even healthcare providers. So it needs to be separated from the actual content that they're giving, okay? And then this is just a list, again, of supplemental things that people can go to, patients especially. Easy to go to websites that are peer-reviewed, updated, constantly, used as guidelines and kind of like the gold standard, right? We have the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, WebMD can even be used, Health Finder, Medline Plus. These are websites that are certified by HON where patients can go to find up-to-date health information. And then just want to do this one slide. So be sure to ask your pharmacist ask your doctor if the information that's being presented doesn't make sense. Go and talk to your healthcare provider, because they're going to have the best information for you, the most up-to-date, reliable information. Again, we don't want health information online to replace what that relationship is with the doctor, with the pharmacist. We want that to be able to enhance the correct health information that's going on, to make sure that we double check, right, what we're learning and what we're seeing in the world today. And Dr. Munlock is just going to finish up with a small conclusion, but I appreciate this.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Sherman. So as he mentioned, these websites need to hit those 8 criteria. So hopefully that shows the credibility of some of these websites we're looking at. So I just want to end the class, or end the talk with a quote. I know that's not actually Yoda, but it's a cute picture of baby Yoda. So this is a quote from The Phantom Menace from 1999. I was about 4 at the time. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. I think with COVID-19 and the misinformation that's going around, I think it's definitely led to fear. That fear leads to anger, or some people have even skipped right to anger. But something that I've been seeing a lot, and even in the Christian community as well, we're really letting hate into our hearts, and that's going to lead to stress and other issues down the line. I know that mental health is a huge issue right now, but overall we need to come together, because right now friends are divided, family are divided by different things you see on the internet. So stay informed, stay healthy. Who the heck is that? And then overall, make sure to contact us, contact your health providers, contact your pharmacists. We're here for you. This is something we do every day, and it's complicated stuff, so we want to make sure you're getting the best information possible. Thank you.